Welcome to part 4 in our series, Dear Admiral Neffenger. This is my letter to Admiral Neffenger, the new TSA administrator. If I ever had the opportunity to visit with him about aviation security and what I think needs to be done. So here we go. We need to get the word out to the police and the airport security community on the real threats. That way we can focus our limited time, our resources, and money on the actual threats. I recently heard a sheriff the other day at a conference talk about how astonished he was that he was able to get on a small Cessna 172 airplane and there wasn't any security that he sees at a commercial service airport. No screening, none of that stuff. He thought this was a gaping hole in security that had just gone ignored, that was missed or just never addressed. He didn't realize that it's comparing apples to oranges. It's a completely different system in general aviation security versus commercial service. Smart man, but how unfortunate that someone without an understanding of the real threats could now be spending money and personnel and efforts and time on something that really represents a lower level threat. I also heard a statistic from a research study the other day saying there's a 1 in 25 million chance of another hijacking. But the assumptions were that air marshals are only there for the transition when the pilot has to use the lavatory, that second flight deck barriers were more effective, frankly, than air marshals, which they might be very effective. That's worth looking at, the second flight deck barriers, but we'll come back to that. Another assumption is the next hijacking is going to look like the last one. It's going to look like 9/11. And another assumption is that cockpit doors are some impenetrable force field. Look, interesting research, but these are dangerous assumptions if one's going to evaluate the real threat, just based on that. Hijackers have been gaining access to locked cockpit doors to decades, and who's to say the next group of hijackers won't have automatic weapons that have been smuggled on board by airline or airport insiders, and the hijacker won't have knowledge of how, or has knowledge of how to exploit or override the cockpit door mechanism or get into the cockpit another way. Look, I'm not giving away secret knowledge here. I'm talking about the TWA 847 hijacking back in 1985. Frankly, there's real value to knowing our history. Look, on September 9th, 2009, a single hijacker hijacked an Aeromexico flight into Mexico City by himself. 2009, armed only with really a line of bull and a cardboard box. There was no let's roll. There was no one stepping up to stop him. In fact, some of the passengers didn't even know the plane had been hijacked. Too often we fail to remember our history. Although this is self-serving, consider adding a textbook like Practical Aviation Security or something that relates to aviation security into the training curriculums for your TSOs, TSIs, and your executive levels. I was recently amazed to see an educational program for TSOs that didn't include any aviation security text, but did include a transportation security text, ironically without an aviation security chapter. It's like teaching football using a book on baseball. Look, I'm a believer in the air marshal layer of security. Just the thought they could be on board is a deterrent factor. Also, please don't listen to the pithy comment crowd. These are the folks that say, but TSA hasn't caught a terrorist yet. Well, that's not really TSA's job. That's the FBI's job. TSA is the deterrent. FBI is supposed to find terrorists, arrest terrorists. TSA's job is to prevent and deter terrorists. If a bad guy has made it all the way to the screening checkpoint, then a lot of other layers in the U.S. national security system have already failed. Second, it's hard to measure a negative. How many times has someone not robbed a house because of a deterrent measure? You know, it's really hard to say because the bad guys don't call us later and say, look, I was going to rob your house today, but wow, I saw the light on the porch on. Actually, if we took all the security away completely, we'd have a baseline. We did that. It was the late 60s and early 70s. There was no screening. There were dozens of hijackings, nearly monthly, and a lot of bombings. I know the air marshal program is costly, but consider moving forward on some other initiatives to help offset that cost. Perhaps allow state and local law enforcement officers to carry concealed on commercial flights. I know that's a program that's been talked about widely, and maybe it's time to get it pushed to the forefront. Be a nice force multiplier. TSA needs to push for real beneficial change in our industry, not just motion without progress. Lasting change that makes a difference. Biometrics. I'm not talking about the screening checkpoint because frankly it's not a big deal when a bad guy slips through the document check as long as he or she is screened and doesn't do anything. Biometrics needs to roll out first in the airport access control areas where we don't have as many layers of physical screening. Plus we have a known database it's a natural place to test a lot of that technology before we roll it out for prime time. Speaking of screening, let's talk about employee screening. While Atlanta, Orlando, Miami have embraced really that TSA-style screening model for their employees, airports are huge. They have huge revenue streams. They can afford to do that. Many smaller airports cannot. There might be more cost-effective ways to conduct employee inspections and get the same result. Just like we used to say in OCS, Semper Gumby. I know that's not an official term, but always flexible. Let's be mission-focused rather than tool-focused. For a quick education, check out a movement that occurred a few years ago when some individuals attempted to get airports to meet the National Fire Protective Association standards for ARF response, aircraft rescue firefighting. Good idea, yeah. But it would have cost so much money that hundreds of U.S. commercial service airports would have been forced to close for what really would have not been determined to really be a net gain in that case. So tomorrow, we're going to talk about the solution to lasting security.